Hello, this is Bob Palmerton, and this is StudioSense, Pastel Painting Demonstration. Today's subject is Mount Rainier, King of the Cascades, from Mount Rainier National Park in the state of Washington. Our lesson concepts today will include aerial perspective, creating lost and found edges, shifting the reference photo around to make a more pleasing composition for a painting, indicating contrast of light and dark, and bringing in a lot of strong color or chroma, especially in the foreground of this particular scene, which contrasts with the haziness and aerial perspective of the distance. The reference photo on top was taken from the Tolmie Peak Lookout, a 5.6-mile hike up Mount Rainier National Park. Highly recommended, and it's a great view. I like to offer a 30% off on all original paintings and prints to my subscribers on YouTube. So again, thank you for visiting, and I hope you enjoy the lesson. And feel free to reach out for the reference photo if you want to try this by yourself. So setting up the composition, I like to split my canvas, and this is UR 300 sanded paper, into thirds. And then what you'll see is when I take a deep blue hard pastel, laying out the composition, the basic composition, but this is where I will shift it from the reference photo. The mountain in the reference photo is pretty much centered. I'm going to shift the mountain off to the right. And so my purpose here is, you look at the viewer will see the pine trees on the left, and that'll be the invitation to follow the view into the valley and the lower hills in front of Mount Rainier toward the mountain and the peak of the mountain. So that's the objective here. Again, by using the thirds, I'm not putting the mountain right in the middle, so you can roughly see the grid that I made, and where it seems to be more of a pleasing setup for the composition. Acrylic underpainting, we're going to do that to build the values of the painting. So there's ultramarine blues, there's some reds and alizarin crimson, and that's the palette that I used. And I'll take a stiff paintbrush, kind of like a old worn paintbrush, and begin to lay out the values of the painting with the acrylic paint. There are so many little nooks and crannies of this view. There's little hills, little peaks. There's snow fields, rocks, hills with pine trees and all kinds of paths in this particular view that we'll pick up. And with all of those, we'll take this acrylic paint, apply a couple of different colors. As I mentioned, we've got the blues, we've got the alizarin crimson, which is going to give us a more of a red hue here, but also the strength of applying the acrylic to generate certain values and focal points within the mountain to kind of take the viewer's eye and follow through from that entry point at the lower left where the pines are, off through the valley, behind it, and toward the mountain peak. So the acrylic underpainting helps, it saves the tooth for your pastel. So it'll give you some basic value and color, but it's not going to impact, because I'm applying it in a very thin way, it's not going to impact the ability of the pastel to stick to the UR sanded paper. The value study that you see there on the lower left was done in pencil, and I'm pretty much going to replicate that value study with this acrylic paint. The reference photo on the upper left was very washed out in the distance. Almost for the first time I saw that reference photo, I barely could even see Mount Rainier, and I was kind of disappointed because here I was up seeing this great view, took the photo, and gosh, where is Mount Rainier? It's really hard to see. So there was an ability, I use digital photo reference photos to reduce the contrast of Mount Rainier. By reducing it, it began to show a lot of these little bumps and curves and edges of the mountain, which we'll convey here in the painting. Again, we got the blue is the light blue is the furthest distance. The purple is the kind of like the middle mountain range, and before that, closer to the foreground of the painting. By the way, I'm applying a little bit of a whitewash acrylic here, again to reinforce that distance in the aerial perspective. But the center part is all pine trees. It's hills of pines. So it's got some of that green, and it's almost a green-blue, again, the blue with the distance, but more of a deep blue-green. And you'll see that's probably one of the most challenging parts of this painting is to build that part of the landscape in pastel. And I'll explain why as we work through it. But I decided I would use a bit of that alizarin crimson purplish color for that darker foreground, and also with the reddishness, the red of the crimson was sort of like a contrast of hue to the greenish color that would be conveyed in those hills. So working from the lightest in the distance toward the darkest and bolder colors in the foreground. So the aerial perspective is sort of like the atmosphere creates, the particles of the atmosphere make it hazier in the distance, and also you lose certain hues the further you go out toward the distance. So I think the most commonly spoken color that disappears in the distance is yellow. So if you have green trees in the distance and the yellow's gone, then all you're really looking at is a blue type color, since the yellow has been removed due to aerial perspective. So we'll work up this center section in this kind of like reddish red maroon for the mid-green hills, and we'll just work darker and bolder with the acrylic as we get closer to the foreground. So besides trying to capture the values in this process of using the acrylic underpainting, I really want to capture the edges at the same time that I want to begin to focus on. Here are the pines, and I'm using this just a deeper ultramarine blue here for the pine trees, working the strokes of the direction of the pines horizontally, as well as the stalks of the pines vertically. The brightest values and the boldest chroma or color will be in the foreground. And that'll add a nice contrast to this painting. When I begin to apply the pastel, we're going to take an alcohol wash and really roughly kind of spread out some of the pine branches, which will add a nice impact as well as contrast. So the foreground is a lot of green in that foreground. There's green grasses, and there's also a lot of rocks, a lot of boulders in this scene. So for the time being, I'm going to place a more of a reddish color toward the foreground. Again, I'm using good deep colors and rich colors and chroma, and that'll provide a nice layer of contrast between this part of the painting. So about it's even less than a third, maybe 25-30% of the painting will be a really deep dark contrast compared to that hazy atmospheric distance of the mountain. Acrylic dries pretty quickly, so you can get right to those pastels in very little time. Washes out with water, nice and clean, no odors or anything like that, and it's I think it does a good job in capturing the the values that I want to establish here in this painting. Again, I use blue predominantly because it's the blue. There's just a lot of blue in this particular view, and the reds. I like the red contrast to pick up that opposites, if you will, or the complementaries of the greens that we'll be bringing in a bit. Starting with a light blue pastel. This is a Mount Vision, very light blue, just to block in the sky. And my preference in painting skies, and here are the different pastels that I'll be using in this painting, but my preference in doing skies is not to compete with the subject matter of the landscape. So if I were to put a bunch of clouds in here, it would really, I think, compete with the mountain and really what our focal point is here. There will be clouds in here because there's a bit of a haze and a glow, and there's a little light clouds and what's called I think it's called a lenticular cloud that seem to be forming above the mountain. So we'll pick that up too, but we'll start with the blue and we'll throw a little bit of very light pink pastel, very high value pink, closer to the horizon and the left edge of the mountain in the sky. So yeah, there was a cloud slightly above the mountain and a bit to the left, and I don't think it was quite the lenticular cloud. If you kind of look that up in terms of what it looks like, what it means, there are some photographs online where some people mistake them for UFOs. They tend to be over mountains and volcanoes. Mount Rainier is a volcano. So it wasn't quite a lenticular cloud, but it's a cloud nonetheless. And I have a very light orange pink pastel. I believe it's also I believe it's a semilayer that I used here to convey those clouds, using my fingers for blending, which is okay. Especially like doing that when I'm working on the sky. Typically a tortillon or a palette knife that I use might be a bit too dirty for the sky, and you want to try to keep that light hue really clean in building the sky. The blue that I used was just not dark enough for the top of the sky, the higher zenith. So I blended in a little bit darker blue here, and kind of helps to convey the edges of those clouds also. So this is a mid-value hard pastel, which I'll help reinforce the edge. And again, we're going to rework these edges several times, just getting the basic blue hue here and the hazy look, and then we'll soften the edges as light kind of envelops around the edges of the mountains. For the snow, I'll focus on using some light pinks, some light oranges, and white. I'll blend in some white and also some very light blue. That another Mount Vision pastel. I think Mount Vision is one of my favorites. Just the large hard pastels. They're not really that hard. They're semi-hard. That really ease the process. The top of the mountain is very hazy and it sort of like blends in with the clouds at the top. So I've got that very light bluish white pastel to help do some of that blending and to build some of the crevices in some of the darker value blues that I added here. A lot of snowfields to capture. Same pastel used for those. I always encourage my students to vary some of those colors. So this is a largely actually a white pastel I'll use here, but to vary some of the colors. So the mountain in the photo looks a lot blue, but bring in some pinks and some oranges and capture those different hues with the light and the sunlight hitting the certain spots of the mountain. If you have a dark value area, try a couple of different colors just to add some variety and also balance those colors out. So if you're using a dark color and you have another dark value area, put that same color in a different area, even if the area is not that color in alone anyway. So it's kind of like adding balance to a painting. This painting is, I'll call this a realist landscape. It's really, I call them, actually I also call these travel paintings, right? So I do a lot of hiking around the country, and I'll simply do a painting that represents scenes that I've visited and hiking. Like if you go to my website, you could see the Yellowstone Falls and other kind of iconic landscapes. So I call those travel paintings, and they're pretty much realist. They're not abstract or having any particular unique conveyance of a scene. I'm just basically replicating, even though I'm changing the reference photo, replicating a view that I experienced on a hike. Working closer to the foreground now, we're starting to see some of those darker values in the painting. So here, this is a hard blue, darker blue pastel. There are also some ochres and grays in the mountains. So this is a Great American Artworks pastel that I've used to begin to block out some of those areas, and we'll keep reworking those as we go along here. For blending pastels, as you saw on the sky, I was using my fingers, and I feel that certainly with clean fingers, it's a more pure, less tainted approach. So I don't use a tortillon or a palette knife. But sometimes I'll use a palette knife exclusively for my blending because the palette knife is clean. The tortillon could pick up some of the color. If I want to spread color, I could use a tortillon that way. Here I'm applying a little bit more light to that blue range to mimic the value study on the lower left. The fun part here will be the piece behind those trees on the left, because those trees will be really deep and dark and colorful, and it will contrast real nicely with the haze. Here's a tortillon that I'm using, and I'm really spreading some of that pastel. One modification we'll make to this painting in a bit are those two lumps there in the distance, those two blue peaks. I'm going to smooth the one on the right down lower, trying to represent the photo in that particular case because it is not as peaky on the right side of that those two peaks as in reality. So we'll try to be a little bit more realistic with that part of the painting. There's a path conveyed here, and so when we work on this middle ground of pines, there are valleys and sort of like pathways that will need to be conveyed, and that also breaks up the pines. As I mentioned earlier, the green hills are the most challenging part of the painting, the green pine area in in the right behind that foreground of pine trees. That area is going to be the most challenging. So we'll want to do a couple of things. We'll want several different values. Some of it will be the light reflecting the tops of the pines. Some of it will be what appear to be pathways through the pine forests. So a darker, almost black, but very deep blue-purple paths through that middle section of the painting. So we'll need to work on that eventually. Applying slightly darker blues again starts building detail in the painting. That's what we're doing there. There's a line of pines down certainly below this top level of the peak, the Tolmie Peak where we are, but also, of course, the pines in the middle section. So I'm going to start with really a rich blue, deep value. This is pretty much a soft pastel, laying out the direction of the pines, the vertical shapes of them. Now it's time to bring the green in here. So we'll scumble over real roughly with a dark green pastel, typically using the side of the pastel for blocking in this part, this value really. The pathways that I mentioned in the pine forest, this is a very dark blue, almost a black pastel, but I want to kind of lay that in there first. And when we structure these pathways, our goal here is to take the viewer's eye up toward the mountain. So between having a pathway like this and also what you'll see in the finished painting is a sense of haze, of fog that I'm going to draw from that lighter blue section where the mountain begins, above this level of trees on a building, toward the viewer. So you'll see how we do that, and the intent, we're always thinking about where the viewer's eye enters the painting and where it exits the painting. Where does the eye and the vision stay in the painting and kind of go around it and continue to look at it. And, so those are kind of some objectives that we want to think about while we're working this composition. This is a lighter green pastel. The tops of the pines picked up sunlight as opposed and contrasting with the lower section of the pines and the valley floor of these pines where it was much darker. So we'll want to get some curves in there to reflect capturing that light, just really roughly at this point, more so to capture the value, and then we'll work a little more detail in there later on. So I want to really soften it up at this point. I don't want it to be too contrasty because it'll compete with the edges that we've made in the mountain. So this area is kind of like a dull, simple block of a little bit of variety of value and color, but it's not really brilliant color. It's something that you just don't want the viewer's eye to be fixated on this section. So as I mentioned, it's a bit of a challenging part, and whenever you look at a reference photo or a scene and you want to paint it, think about what it's going to take to convey that in a painting. Is that going to be a challenge or not? Is it, if you're looking at a scene and there's a lot of grasses in the foreground, you're going to think, well, how am I going to convey those grasses, because it's just a lot and it's going to be distracting. So how do I handle it so that it's not distracting to the viewer? Again, our focal point here is the mountain and the haze, and again, another not a focal point, but the entry point of the strong pines on the left will be important too. So I didn't want the middle value to compete with either that distance, that focal point, or the boldness and the chroma of the foreground. Back with the tortillon to kind of soften this up. And notice how I built this deep blue valley in this pine forest. Kind of brings you again toward the mountain. Little contrast there with the edge of that deep valley and the light blue hazy look at the base of the mountain. And some of the atmospheric impact is created by taking other blue pastels and lighter blue pastels. You could use a mid-value here that looks lighter against that very dark blue-black pathway in the pines, and that gives it some more of a foggy impact also. So I like that contrast with that lighter blue hazy look at the base of the mountain. So I'm going to reinforce that, and it contrasts pretty nicely with the edge of those pines. Softening with the tortillon to keep it from being too distracting. So by having the softer edges, that'll keep this section from distracting our view to that area versus the more focal point of the mountain. All of these video clips have been speeded up, as you could tell. Just to kind of highlight some of the main points in here. Nothing's been edited out, but it is the continuous creation of the painting, just speed it up for a bit, and you can certainly slow down the video or speed it up further if you'd like, and skip some sections. So really what's left now is the foreground to begin to get that laid in here. And part of the foreground, or the further part of the foreground, has a series of pine trees also on this hill right behind the main foreground of the two or three large pines. You can see tips of pine trees that really roll down to a hill toward, I believe it's Eunice Lake, which is down probably about 600 feet below where we're below this view, as part of that wonderful Tolmie Peak Lookout hike. So I use a deep green for those pines, and placed in the direction of the pines, and beginning to show some of that blue haze, and that'll also contrast with this deeper chroma area in the foreground. Bit of a lighter value, gray-blue, to bring out the edges of the hill of pines there in the middle. Similarly, this will contrast nicely with the deep color of those pines, those large pines on the left. So it's hard to see this, but I have the smallest piece of pastel, which is a very deep purple color, and I like using that as the base of my pine trees. So we'll layer this in here first. And then we'll apply the local color of the pines, the green and the yellow-green hues. But first I want to use a small pastel, which you can't even see, to get this base of the pine, get the base of the pine trees here. Notice how the values still pretty much reflect the value study on the lower left. And also the photograph. The value in the photograph are pretty much replicated here in the painting. I didn't want this foreground section, this pinkish red section, to be flat across the bottom, horizontally across the bottom of the landscape. So I'm going to vary this a bit also, whereby you'll have darker values on the lower left third of this this base, if you will, as opposed to the right side. So we'll fill that in later. But for now, we're doing the alcohol wash. So we'll use some isopropyl alcohol. We'll go back to that stiff brush, and we'll start swiping those pine branches into each other and into the and show how contrasting those are against the light background. It's nice to kind of, you can let some of this drip and travel down through the painting. Not too much though, because you'll get some buckling of the paper. This is the UART paper is mounted on foam core, so I don't want to see buckling here. So you could get some of the deep dark color here to drip, and then you might want to just dab it up with paper towel. So notice how the foreground is becoming so much bolder than the distance. It's almost like the foreground is almost like a stage, and the distance is the backdrop scenery on a play on a stage. So what we're going to do is, after applying this deep underpainting of pastel to these pines, we're going to pick up some nice bold greens, yellows, and oranges. You can sort of see that in the reference photo, but what I did with the reference photo, which you don't see in this example, is I saturated that photo. Again, it was digital on my computer, and I saturated the color to bring out some of those oranges and reds that were visible, and the trunks of the pines and part of the pines and the pine cones. Now, the interesting feature of this bold, dark foreground is that the sun was directly shining on this area. So we'll begin layering various values, shades of green, and then picking up some really nice highlights of bright yellows and yellow greens and orange. And it will really take you, will kind of, again, put the viewer's perspective, and hey, I'm really looking at this section, and then I'm looking toward the mountain up through that deeper blue valley that you see through the pines. So there again, the horizon, that horizontal base has been curved downward to the left to break up that monotony of a horizontal surface. I'm often asked, like, what part of the painting do you work on first and in the middle, and you just kind of go back and forth wherever you feel like you want to work. Typically, I would stand back at a painting and look at it and decide, hey, what do I want differently, or what's going to change? And I'll go back, I'll take some notes, and then I'll follow those notes the next morning when I'm resuming the painting. This is a lighter green now, and I'm going to start blocking in this bold, it's a bold green, chroma, strong chroma in the foreground. There's, as I mentioned earlier, there are grasses and shrubs and rocks and boulders that are really picking up a lot of direct sunlight, so you'll have a lot of variety of highlights on those rocks, as well as the shade beneath the rocks. It's almost as if I'm applying a whole new, different pastel palette at this point, as opposed to the aerial perspective of the distance. These are really rough strokes. I don't want to get into much detail here, but I really want to convey the brilliance of the sunlight at this point, as well as the shapes of the shrubs and the branches and how they're picking up that sunlight. Using some Great American artworks here, some mid-value greens. Remember, those mid-values are going to look really light, contrasting with that very dark base of the pines. Bringing in some slightly darker green values for the base of shrubs and the lower portion of these reasonably tall grasses back there. Again, not much detail, just conveying the chroma and conveying the values and the masses and the shapes of these shrubs. So we're looking for compositional variety here. We don't have any straight lines. We don't have any strong definition of one section versus another. Just trying to throw a lot of variety in the foreground. There's some really bright edges of rocks that you can see pretty clearly in the reference photo on the top left. So bring in some of those highlights here on the rock edges, and then just kind of keep filling that in. Ultimately, we'll want to apply the true pine colors to those pine trees. We're not going to leave them as a deep purple blue. So I would encourage you to experiment with some different colors in here. You could throw some pinks in here, and you want to balance out some color. You could even throw some very light blue in here, possibly reflecting some of the shade around some of the rocks. And that helps balance some of that color. So you have color in one spot as well as another spot. That provides a nice harmony to the painting. Reworking some of the peaks and valleys of that row of pines. We'll also work that background section there. See how it kind of blends in with the pine on the left, the tall pine on the left. We're going to delineate that a little bit better by lightening up the distant section, and that'll help bring forward that pine tree on the left. We'll do that in just a bit. So if you look at pine trees, there's a fair amount of orange, an orange glow, yellow-orange that you'll see, a little bit of a reddish color also. So this row of pines here, I didn't want them to be just dark and lifeless. So we want to add some semblance of edges where the light is being captured. And again, there's that balance thing where we don't want to have a little bit over there too, because there definitely is orange in those foreground, large foreground pine trees too. So this is a very cheap, hard pastel. I don't know what brand it is, but don't hesitate to buy really cheap used pastels if you can find them. And they could certainly have a purpose here in terms of blending, as well as simply some of the pastel painting that you do. So eventually we're going to start bringing in color to those pines. Still a little more detail though on the value masses of the foreground. So again, not real detail, but blotches of darker value greens and lighter greens to convey really what was really a bumpy, kind of rocky foreground up here at the Tolmie Peak Lookout. By using digital photographs, we can hone in, we can zoom in into the detail and really see what's behind all that landscape in the photograph. So I like to zoom in and pick up these nuances, which I'm representing now with this deeper blue pastel, shady areas and ridges that you can pick up with detail. It's a very effective way of conveying a certain level of minutia in the painting without getting too caught up in drawing those details. So I'll continue to use the side of my pastel to pick up some of the deeper blues, which I feel is contrasting pretty nicely with the other more local color in the middle pine area, as well as the darker foreground. My daughter summited Mount Rainier a couple of years ago, so I feel that I need to have a certain level of realism toward these edges and little hills that climb up toward the peak. Mount Rainier is 14,410 feet above sea level. And it's amazing how it just pops out of a landscape up in Washington if you've been out there. It's an active volcano, a stratovolcano, and the last recorded eruptions or volcanic eruption activity was 1854. And there are always occasional tremors, and ever since, certainly in the last 100 years, 150 years, the population has grown significantly in that area, considering the cities of Tacoma and Seattle and Puyallup. So everywhere you see, just like you do in Florida with hurricane evacuation routes, you have the same for volcanic eruption evacuation routes. We want to keep bringing forward the pines on the left, so by lightening up the background between them, sort of like if you think of sky holes in a tree canopy, we're building holes behind these pines to bring them forward even further. Now it's time to start layering in the local hues of these pines. So I'm using a dark green soft pastel. I believe this is a unison pastel. And the greens are, you've got that blue-green look to pines, but also there's a fair amount of orange, yellow, green, dark values, and the lighting will hit the pines coming from the left, so eventually we're going to apply even a lighter green-yellow hue to those pines. But by starting darker and then building lighter pastel on top of the darkness, we create that layering and that three-dimensional look on the pine trees. So I like to leave a fair amount of that dark, deep blue purple behind in those trees to help build that contrast and also build that layering 3D effect. It's a nice thing about pastels, and especially using this UArt paper. This is UArt 400 grade. The lower grades for UArt paper are rougher, so 100, 200, 300 are heavier sanded papers, and the higher numbers are for very fine pastel work and drawing. This is a Great American Artworks. I like the rectangular type pastels for two reasons. Of course, using the side of the pastel is very effective, but they have nice edges, and you can work those, use those edges to get a little more detail. Now these branches are kind of strong and coming up pretty emphatically on the pines, so I'll resort to using either tortillon or a palette knife, a plastic palette knife, or a pastel pencil, like a yellow-green pastel pencil, to blend some of these branches into the darker base of the pines. But here so the sun is really catching the edges of those branches, and that's what I want to convey here. Bringing in just a little lighter color. And you can see there I took one little simple dab just to make sure I felt like it was the right value. This is very bright, and I'll soften this up a bit with a pencil, a pastel pencil in a bit. So here I'm taking the tortillon to do some of that spreading out of the strong lit branches. The tops of the pines, they'll begin to wither away against the sky, so we'll be using a little bit lighter greens and just a little bit brownish orange pastel, and pastel pencils come in handy at this stage, as well as the sharp edges of hard pastels to get some of that branch detail contrasting to the bright sky. And don't hesitate to apply a different color into this dark value. So the really dark black, brown, black, blue, purple hue of the shade. If you brought like a really dark red in there, a spot or two, I think it's kind of a nice effect, and it just adds more variety to the painting, a little more color, a little more interest. There go those oranges. Again, you can kind of see them in the reference photo, where there's some a range of sort of like a dark orange to a couple of bright orange spots in those pines. It's not only the trunk of the pines that bring out some of that color, but some of the actual pine tone groupings that you'll see some of that color. And it's a nice contrast, of course, with the green and the complementaries, that red and green complementary hue. Even the orange with the deep blue that you've got not only at the base inside of the pines, but also the blues that are in the background on the hill behind the 2 pines there on the left. Again, the sharp side of the pastel, nothing needs to be straight, crooked as nature. It's the way it looks. So go in there kind of roughly and block in some of those masses. The painting has a series of shrubs in front of the pines, and they're kind of haphazard. So I'll just pick up the kind of like just the rough lighting of those shrubs. I'm not going to get into drawing leaves or anything of that level of detail. The orange, this is a burnt orange pastel, orange brown pastel that comes in really handy with pine trees. Certainly at the tips of the trees as we climb further up to the sky, and those thin out, see, as you can see how they thin out at the top and kind of fade or wither away. And also to help highlight and blend in some of the pine colors that I've built on these trees. So I put in some of this light orange and also this burnt orange and some also lighter green, because the light wraps around the edges of the narrow branches and the branches kind of fade. And that's what you want to convey here at this point. So I think we've distinguished now the left side of that left pine from the background. Notice there's not a whole lot of value difference between the lower part of the background of those pines and the pines themselves. So we want to soften the background a bit further, and that will contrast with the sharpness of those pine branches. My favorite techniques is continuing to work the aerial perspective behind a strong foreground, so a little bit lighter blue contrast. We call these hill holes rather than sky holes. How about that? This lighter blue pastel is effective in creating that foggy path, and it's a hard pastel also, so it helps build that hazy look through the hills behind these pines toward the mountain, and using the same pastel on the mountain spots builds better balance in the painting and harmony in the painting. So that's the approach I'm using currently. So Mount Rainier is also known as Tahoma. It's a large active stratovolcano in the Cascade range of the Pacific Northwest in the United States. As I mentioned before, it's 14,400 and change feet, the highest mountain in the U.S. state of Washington and the Cascade Range. It's actually considered, I think, the second most dangerous volcano in the world, largely due to the populations that surround the volcano. As I mentioned, this pastel lesson has a lot to do with building lost and found edges. So we're going to build a found edge here, a little more contrast against that light blue of the mountain edge. And then we'll soften that transition up a bit. In the center of this landscape, right the dip right in the middle, there's a very steep hill that heads way down to Eunice Lake. It's a beautiful glacial green-blue lake that you walk around and hike around on this Tolmie Peak hike in Mount Rainier National Park. To get there, you've got to drive through a 17-mile, unless you're camping out there somewhere, you've got a 17-mile dirt and gravel road, and we had taken that path in the early morning. It was probably about 7 in the morning, and the sun was just coming up. It was really bright, and with all the dust from the road and the sun glaring through the trees, there are actually spots where you couldn't see. It was like a blind spot traveling along on this road. Eventually, we got to the parking area, and there were already probably about 4 or 5 cars parked along the road at the trailhead for the Tolmie Peak Lookout hike. What's interesting is the van we drove, because of all the dust and dirt, the pneumatic lifts for the trunk of the car failed, so the trunk would not stay open, or you cannot it would not lift without a whole lot of effort. And we were traveling, so we had to hold it up hold up the trunk whenever we were putting luggage in the back. So we eventually had to get those items replaced in the car, and I think it was all the dust that this road kicked up. But the hike was just wonderful, and you just traverse various switchbacks, climbing up the mountain, and then wrapping around and seeing Lake Eunice Lake, and then from that perspective, you can see the lookout tower at the top of the mountain, the top of the peak, and had probably the best view of Mount Rainier. So I'd say the value study on the lower left sketch is pretty representative of where we are currently with the painting. The value study, I did not show any of that very foreground detail where it's the brightest part where the rocks are. We just kind of left that blank there. Again, just trying to get some of those rough masses and lights and darks of the painting. This photograph is not saturated. I'll occasionally saturate a photograph to bring out colors that are not evident in the original photo that I had taken. So building just a variety of hills and shaded areas. Just makes the painting more attractive. You'll also, at some point, not focus so much on the reference photo and just begin to use artist license in building certain effects. The painting really did not have this, or the photograph did not have this hazy blue path through the trees. But I like to create that effect. And also the lighter blue that you see behind the smaller pines on the left, which are right, are behind those 2 large pines. All that lighting back there is all additional to what you see in the photograph. This is a very deep, hard blue pastel pencil, deep blue pastel pencil, which I like to use for blending and also for shaded areas. It's my most worn pastel pencil. It's the smallest one so far, and it's going to have to replace that at some point. George Vancouver named Mount Rainier in honor of his friend Rear Admiral Peter Rainier. The map of Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804 and 1806 refers to it as Mount Rainier. So the distance is going to have a lot of softer edges, and the dotted lines coming in handy to help soften and blend some of that pastel. So blue pastel is your best friend when you're conveying aerial perspective, as you can see. I like to ask my students how many of them tend to repeat patterns in a painting. That could be a placement of trees or rocks, other objects, and you'll find that sometimes you actually repeat a pastel stroke or an object, and you've got to kind of get out of that thinking. I think it's just a habit to some extent that some artists fall into, and you just kind of catch yourself and make changes. So those those little two peaks along Rainier were sort of like a repeat of two edges. And you notice now that the edge on the right is lower, and that's the probably about 60% from the bottom of the painting up, if you can see that. The pointed blue edge on the left is higher and sharper than the more rounded edge to its right, to the right of it. So that's where I actually had the mistake of replicating items in a painting. So make sure we think about what we're representing and what if anything, we're repeating, and think about what objects that are in the painting that might distract the viewer and cause that viewer's eye to head in the wrong direction or get stuck in the painting. That's why we do these compositions. I'll always do a sketch of a painting first, very simple sketch, and then do the value study. This is a very deep blue black pastel. I don't know what the brand is, but I do find this handy also to build some contrast in some spots. So I add a little more contrast behind the lighter green yellow leaves of the pines, and for balance in the painting, I'm going to help bring that up a little bit out in the distance, and continue on these lost and found edges to add variety to the scene. Makes you wonder, like, what am I looking at over here? What am I looking at over there? Is there a gap in the trees? Is there another hill, a big shaded area? You may find yourself not looking at the reference photo as much at this stage of the painting, or just kind of going through the entire canvas and making adjustments that you kind of feel like you want to do, and you do them. And some of it's a personal preference. From a technical perspective, it's not necessary, but other times it just kind of helps build the harmony in the landscape painting. I did speed up this part of the video a bit further It's literally just going back and forth, adding ridges to parts of these mountains, hazing out some areas a little bit further, just going back and forth to refine the painting. One could, you step back and you look at the painting and you say, okay, what other changes do I want to make? Often, what's interesting is you take a mirror and you look at the painting through the mirror, so you're looking at it in the reverse, and that also kind of helps you decide, hey, I want to make a change here in this path or in this line. I want to kind of squiggle this line somewhat to create a little more variety, makes it look a little bit better from a compositional point of view. That darker blue now, I really like how I was adding that darker value to that ridge on the left, and that helped bring out contrast, that distance, that light distance blue. A little more light in that background. There's a nice little bit of contrast there. So, as I mentioned, the most recent recorded volcanic eruption of Mount Rainier was between 1820 and 1854, but many eyewitnesses report eruptive activity in many years, as late as 1894. There are seismic monitors placed in the park. Really do lose a fair amount of the view of the mountain once it hits that cloudy area up on the upper left edge. So with that palette knife, I helped blend some of that mountain part back into the sky. Sometimes I'm asked how long it takes to do a painting like this. So this video was recorded over a week's time. I'll typically do my pastel landscape painting early in the morning, like 5 a.m., anywhere between like 5 and 7 a.m. So at best, I'll have about an hour and a half of time to work on a painting. So through that week, it was about 7 days a week. It was probably about 10 hours of work here. Again, as I mentioned earlier, clean fingers come in handy to help blend when you're dealing with a very light value sky type colors. I have used a Tortline in the past and it dirtied the sky, same with the palette knife. So check your fingers, dry them off, clean them, dry them off, and then use them for the blending. There is in the reference photo, there is another clump of bushes in the front there, right about in the center, which I just marked. Don't want too much emphasis on them, so I really like the pines on the left are we'll call them somewhat of a focal point, not quite the focal point of the painting. And there could be a couple of different focal points depending on how you draw that viewer's eye through the painting. So you look at the trees and then you look at the mountain, you kind of go back and forth. On the foreground, I used bright yellow, orange yellow pastel, and I brought in some bright pinks too, very bright, high value pinks. Unison has a really good set of light pastels, and I brought the same color into the mountain also to create that balance. So I mentioned this foggy path. This is a hard pastel, kind of a mid-value pastel because the background that I'm putting it on is pretty dark. So it's a mid-value pastel. But I wanted to connect, see how I'm connecting that mid-ridge of pines to the foggy area of Rainier. And I'll work that up a little bit further. That helps draw the viewer's eye toward the mountain. So think about, when you think about a composition, think about the curves that you build, the pathway. I do a lot of paths, paintings with paths in them because of the hiking that I do. So those become real handy in terms of drawing the viewer's attention toward a focal point. You could have fog impacts like this, tree lines, you name it. You could find ways of creating that visual activity for the viewer of the painting. At this point, I'm really just kind of going over various spots, but I'm also like standing back and looking at the painting again and seeing what I might want to change. It's always good to have distance between yourself and the painting, or using the mirror effect and looking at the painting, or in making a note and going back and honing in and making a change, and keeping notes too. So you look at a painting. What I like to do is I put the painting, I send it to my smartphone, and I put it up on my pedestal that's on my car when I'm driving, and I'll put it up there and I'll look at it occasionally when I'm driving, and just record changes that I want to make to the painting the next time I go back to work, and I'll work on the painting, and I'll put notes on my computer about what changes I want to do, and just one after the other. Eventually, you'll get to the point where you're just making one or two small changes to the painting each morning, and it's just not, you're pretty much hitting the spot where you think, hey, I think this is done. So I kind of like those edges then that I had highlighted a little further in terms of hardened a bit with the darker blue, and then contrast that a bit with some snow. Can't forget that there's a lot of snow on this mountain. Light blue for snow, light blues, pinks, a little bit of orange, kind of certainly add variety to your snow fields. So these are some mid-value colors that I'm adding. The distance, there is as I mentioned, there's this steep hill that goes down toward Eunice Lake, and I want to kind of create that there is light between these pines, but it's generally a dark area. If you look at the reference photo, you can see that it's not a whole lot of light down there because of the depth of the forest, of the pine forest. So we're just going to use some mid-value hues to bring out some of that dimension that's sitting there in the darkness. Because pines are upright, the palette knife I'm using is being used from an upright kind of a fashion, vertically rather than horizontally. I'll do the opposite. I'll use horizontal strokes of the palette knife to blend on the pine trees, for example, because obviously those branches are off on a horizontal footing. using those mid-tone values there gives you the impression that there's a distance that you're heading down toward some other abyss, which you're not going to want to climb down because you can't. It's a pretty steep hill down there below, and of course you don't see Eunice Lake at all, but it's down there. So these fire towers, this is where the Tolmie Peak Fire Lookout. These fire towers are situated in various mountainous areas where someone would be stationed on, literally to look for any forest fires. A little more of that deep orange balance there. I think you get the gist of what's going on here. It's literally going back and forth. And you can also speed up the YouTube video, and it'll be moving really fast. But slow it down too, and see what I'm doing relative to some of the points, because you notice there's no repetition in here now. Everything is you've got various a lot of variety of pastel marks. Let your imagination run in terms of what you're looking at, and what part of the forest you're looking at and where. This is a very light blue pastel. It's almost white, but I wanted to bring up some of that glare that the sun created on the boulders and the rocks there in the foreground. And by doing that, you can't forget that there's shade under those rocks, so this darker deep orange color came in handy to create shade beneath those boulders. All of these short, bold strokes helped to create that image that this foreground here with the pines and the ground are almost on a stage by themselves compared to the distance. Makes it sort of like a three-dimensional kind of a pastel landscape. You can imagine that I had stood back then and looked at this painting and decided what else I wanted to do with those darker spots there on the mountain with that dark blue. It needed a little more contrast, and the photograph was so washed out I had to reduce the contrast level of the digital photo to be able to see a lot of these valleys and crevices in the mountain. So I wanted to bring those back out here to add a little more contrast, but not too much because of the aerial perspective. We don't want to enhance or darken that value too much. So thanks to Wikipedia, you're having a little lesson about Mount Rainier. Typically up to 5 earthquakes are recorded monthly near the summit of Mount Rainier. Swarms of 5 to 10 shallow earthquakes over 2 or 3 days can take place from time to time, predominantly in the region of about 13,000 feet below the summit. Glaciers are among the most conspicuous and dynamic geologic features of Mount Rainier. So the visit to Mount Rainier National Park was one of several national park trips that I took this past summer. I'll gather probably about 1,000 photographs of the scenery from various hikes, and then decide, okay, which paintings I'm going to do, pastel paintings I'm going to do from these photographs. And if you take a lot of photographs, think about that there's views in those particular photographs that may be worth several different paintings. It could be a level of honing in on focusing on a certain part of a landscape photograph, or it could be doing something creative with some art that you got inspired by looking at that scene in that photograph. So think about if you take all these photographs, there's probably so much more material in there than you can imagine to create art. Here's a very light, this is a white pastel. I tried to avoid using whites and blacks, but I just needed to do a little more highlights here on certain areas of the snowfields along the edges of Mount Rainier. Another major hike at Mount Rainier is the Skyline hike, which brings you up a lot higher, higher up the mountain. But you're basically on the mountain, so you really don't have as great a view of the mountain as you do from this particular vantage point. But it's a wonderful hike, and you see wildlife and beautiful alpine flowers, and a lot of fog and pretty cold up there too. It was we got there to do the hike at the Paradise Visitor Center. It was, gosh, I think it was about 38 degrees, so we're definitely underdressed as we headed up the mountain, but then it warmed up. It was cloudy and foggy at first, but then the sun broke out and the mountains were just beautiful. So there's definitely more pastel painting opportunities from that particular hike at Mount Rainier, and that was third week of July this past summer, 2023. There's that foggy bank again that I wanted to pull through, that effect of using that hard blue pastel to soften a path of fog and atmosphere as you kind of get into that section of the mountain where there's that lighter blue foggy impact. So this painting is essentially done. Just a few more highlights and a few more dark spots and working a few more edges here and there. So in terms of the materials, again, as you are 400 paper, acrylic paints is the underpainting, hard and soft pastels, and applying an isopropyl alcohol wash to the pines to help build that contrast and emphasis in the front. I added a little more, sort of like a light periwinkle color up in the clouds. Again, I don't want the clouds to contrast or distract very much at all from the rest of the painting. So it was just very light and soft and blended with my fingers. So I will not put a fixative. I will not spray this painting. We'll just mount it with either a plein air frame, or we'll put a mat around it and lift the mat up off the painting. But I'll whack it in the back so that any pastel dust falls off. But typically the paper holds the pastel. I don't have any issues with that. And here we have it, Mount Rainier, king of the Cascades. A little more light green at the edges of those pines. ask me for the digital reference photo, email me there. And don't forget, YouTube sub is the coupon name for a 30% discount over of any original pastels or prints on my website. Thanks for visiting.